October 1960. Vnukovo Airport, late evening. The maintenance inspection log is just an ordinary graph paper notebook, the kind there were thousands of across the Soviet Union. A technician writes something down, then looks at what he wrote. Then he takes his pen and crosses it out, carefully, with a single line. Next to it, he writes a different wording, neutral, safe. Then he closes the logbook. We do not know exactly what he saw. What he felt is not hard to guess. By October 1960, Soviet technicians already knew how to sense these things, how to see what they were not supposed to see, and know what to do with it. Cross it out. Rephrase it. Don't create problems where, officially, no problems exist. And officially, everything was perfect. 2 years earlier, in April 1958, the IL-18 was ceremonially presented to the world. Not just shown off, presented as proof. Here it was, the Soviet mainline turboprop airliner. 4 engines, more than 80 passengers, and a range many of its competitors simply did not have. And yes, it was beautiful. There is no arguing that. A sleek silhouette, tall landing gear, the distinctive drone of its propellers audible around the airport several minutes before touchdown. Khrushchev himself flew on it. The newspapers covered every new route breathlessly. The Soviet airliner conquers, just fill in the continent. The world was watching. The world was supposed to envy it. And this is where things start to get strange. Because while Aeroflot was ceremonially opening routes, the IL-18 entered commercial service on April 20th, 1959, someone in the maintenance departments knew something, saw something, and carefully crossed it out. To understand the scale of what was happening, we need to go back to the mid-1950s. At that point, Soviet civil aviation was still flying the Li-2, a licensed Douglas DC-3 designed back in the 1930s, and the IL-14, a post-war aircraft, but still piston-powered. Reliable machines, workhorses. They flew all over the Soviet Union, landed on unpaved runways in Siberia, and connected a country spread across 7 time zones. Respected airplanes. But the rest of the world was already taking the next step. On May 2nd, 1952, the British de Havilland Comet entered scheduled service, the world's first jet airliner. In October 1958, the Americans launched the Boeing 707. Against that backdrop, Soviet civil aviation looked like something from another era. Politically, that was unbearable. Tupolev was already building the Tu-104, a jet, fast, prestigious, and based on the Tu-16 bomber. On the surface, that looked like the answer. Push out jet airliners, solve the political problem. Ilyushin said no. Not loudly, not theatrically, just no. Turboprop. His arguments were purely engineering, efficiency, range, and the ability to operate from short and unpaved runways, which made up the majority in the country. Late 1950s jet engines guzzled fuel, demanded long concrete runways, and required complex maintenance. For a country with vast distances and weak airfield infrastructure, that was not solving a problem. It was creating a new one. He was heard. The USSR Council of Ministers issued the decree to develop the IL-18 on May 25, 1956, and the prototype made its first flight on July 4, 1957. And here I want to pause, because Ilyushin's decision would prove remarkably right. The IL-18 would remain in civil aviation service for more than 40 years. About 15 countries would buy it, and it would be on this aircraft that millions of Soviet citizens first rose above the clouds. But the right decision was not the whole story. The right decision can kill, too, especially when it is carried out inside the system that carried this one out. The technician at Vnukovo in October 1960 did not know the whole picture. He saw one detail, something in the pattern of wear or in a number that did not match the limit in the manual. He wrote it down, then crossed it out. Maybe he got scared. Maybe someone senior explained what it was properly called. Maybe he simply understood this. Creating problems on paper meant creating problems for himself. And the airplane was flying. There it was on the ramp, 4 engines, everything working. Why ruin the beautiful picture? That beautiful picture would hold for a few more years. Then it would start to come apart, quietly, without public investigations, without official admissions. Airplanes would crash. The Design Bureau would introduce design changes without calling them corrections of mistakes. It was a triumph of Soviet engineering, and at the same time, a story about a system that did not know how to admit its own defects, even when the price of silence was measured in lives. The IL-18 became a great airplane. The question I am not going to answer too early is, at what cost? To answer it, we need to go back to how the aircraft came into being in the first place. Back to Ilyushin, who went against the current. Back to the AI-20 engine they chose to bet on. And back to what, exactly, was wrong with that engine from the very beginning, and what they decided to do about it. Mid-1950s, the Soviet Union is still flying on what it had flown in the war. The Li-2 was, in essence, the American Douglas DC-3, which the Soviets had begun adapting under license as early as 1938, and then building in series before the war. A reliable airplane, proven. But by the time the young engineer Vladimir Ivanov was showing up for work at the Ilyushin Design Bureau, that aircraft was already 20 years old. 20 years is not an age for technology. It is a sentence. The IL-14 was better, more modern, and Soviet, but it too remained piston-powered, propeller-driven, slow. Moscow to Tashkent, 7 to 8 hours. Moscow to Khabarovsk, not even non-stop, but with landings, transfers, and long waits in drafty terminals somewhere in Omsk or Novosibirsk. The Soviet Union was a huge country. Flying across it in the mid-1950s was like taking a horse cart onto a highway. And now, what was happening outside the Soviet Union? On May 2, 1952, the British airline BOAC launched scheduled service on the de Havilland Comet, the world's first jet airliner. Not a prototype, not an experiment, a production aircraft flying regular routes. London to Johannesburg, London to Singapore. A speed of 800 kilometers per hour. This was not just new technology, it was a new era. In the USSR, people read about the comet in Technika Molodezhi and stared at the photographs. Then, of course, something terrible happened to the comet. Fatigue cracks in the fuselage structure. 3 crashes in a row. The entire fleet grounded. They read about that, too, and drew conclusions, each their own. And this is where things start to get strange. Those conclusions, made in haste and without a full understanding of what had happened, would echo again more than once later on. For now, just note this. In Moscow, at the Ministry of Aviation Industry, they already understood by then this could not go on. The country needed a mainline airliner, modern, Soviet, and preferably one that did not crash. There was only one question: jet or turboprop? Tupolev had already placed his bet on jets. His Tu-104, a passenger conversion of the Tu-16 bomber, was nearly ready. Fast, powerful, impressive. Speeds approaching 900 kilometers per hour. The Soviet jet airliner had to reach scheduled service before the American Boeing. This was politics. This was prestige. This was the kind of thing you could confidently report to Khrushchev. Ilyushin saw it differently. By then, Sergey Vladimirovich Ilyushin was a living legend. The IL-2 had won the war. Not by itself, of course, but no one disputed its contribution. He was a man with stature, a man who could tell the leadership something other than what it wanted to hear. And he did. His argument against an all-jet aircraft sounded simple, almost peasant-like. Where exactly were you going to fly it? Soviet civil aviation was not London to New York. It was Moscow to Krasnoyarsk, Moscow to Alma-Ata, Irkutsk to Yakutsk. Runways were short, many of them unpaved. Fuel at remote airports was scarce. A jet engine guzzles kerosene on takeoff and landing. And they needed to fly to places where that kerosene barely existed. A turboprop was more economical, twice as efficient, maybe more. And it could get off the ground from dirt strips. Then there was range. The task was to fly from Moscow to Vladivostok with a full payload. Jets of that era could not do that without refueling. A turboprop could. It sounds logical, but in 1955, it sounded like a step backward. The whole world was charging into the jet age, and Ilyushin was proposing a propeller. Colleagues were skeptical. The bosses were doubtful. Tupolev was openly condescending. And yet, Ilyushin stood his ground. On May 25, 1956, the USSR Council of Ministers issued its decree. Ilyushin was ordered to build a mainline turboprop passenger airliner, designation IL-18. The deadlines by aviation standards were fantasy. Ilyushin was right to choose the turboprop layout. His calculations were correct across the board: range, operating economics, infrastructure. On April 20, 1959, the IL-18 entered its first scheduled service. Within a few years, it opened routes no one had seriously imagined before. The aircraft really did fly where jets could not. That part is true. But here is the other truth. The decision was right, and the execution was not. Or rather, not completely. In a system where admitting a problem was more dangerous than hiding it, even the most fundamentally sound aircraft begins to kill. Not because it was badly designed, but because no one wants to be the first to raise a hand and say, "Something here is wrong." And that hand should have gone up very soon. A little later, we'll come back to one detail, to the AI-20 engine. For now, just note this. It was new, brilliant on paper, powerful, and nowhere near fully developed by the time Ilyushin decided to stake everything on it. Right now, that does not look like the main problem. Later, it will. May 25th, 1956. Moscow, Staraya Square. The decree of the USSR Council of Ministers is already on Ilyushin's desk, signed. Sergey Vladimirovich reads it in silence. A second time. A third. Then he closes the folder. Those who were there later recalled that he did not celebrate. He did not curse. He just sat there for a few seconds and said, without lifting his head, "All right then, let's do the math." The IL-18 specification had now been officially issued. Range: 3,500 kilometers with a full commercial payload. That meant Moscow to Vladivostok with one stop, or across all of Europe without refueling. Cruising speed: 625 to 650 kilometers per hour, almost like a fighter of that era. Except this aircraft had to weigh dozens of tons and carry 100 passengers. And the time allowed until first flight, 13 months, just over a year, for a huge, completely new mainline airliner. It was not merely absurd, it was madness. But at the time, people preferred not to think about that, or at least not to say it out loud. Up to that point, Soviet civil aviation did, of course, have airplanes. It had routes, it had schedules, but it lacked one thing: a modern mainline airliner capable of linking the vast country from one end to the other without stops. The IL-14 was a good aircraft, reliable, proven, but it was a regional airplane. 4,000 kilometers was beyond it. 400? Sure. The Li-2, a relic of the war, with canvas seats and vibration in every frame, was still flying out on the periphery. The problem was something else. While the USSR was still deciding what to do next, the rest of the world was already flying. The de Havilland Comet, the world's first jet airliner, entered commercial service back in May 1952. The British were out in front of everyone. True, by 1954, 3 comets had already crashed. Fatigue cracks in the fuselage, a design flaw no one had anticipated. The aircraft were pulled from service and redesign work began. But the fact remained: the jet age had already arrived, and the Soviet Union was late to it. On the horizon was the Boeing 707. The Americans were not rushing, they were doing it right. And that, in itself, was a bad sign. At that moment, Tupolev was already flying. The Tu-104, a converted Tu-16 bomber with a passenger cabin, entered service in 1956. Fast, rough, and full of compromises, but it was a jet. For propaganda, it was a victory. For technicians and pilots, it was, to put it mildly, an aircraft with a very temperamental character. It was at exactly this moment that Sergey Vladimirovich Ilyushin firmly said no to the jet configuration. At the time, not everyone understood that decision. Some people at Sagi, the ones who were used to calculating everything down to the last nail, the last rivet, whispered that it was technical suicide. That Ilyushin, a genius of piston-powered aircraft, was stuck in the past. Views like that were quickly lost in the flow of party expediency. No one wanted to be the person who stood in the way of a major prestige project. And that was a mistake. Ilyushin's answer was roughly this. The world was moving to jet propulsion at airports with 3-kilometer concrete runways and developed refueling infrastructure. We have only a handful of airports like that. But the cities that need to be connected number in the hundreds. And a good half of them still greet an airplane with an unpaved strip and a hand pump for kerosene. That is not poetry. It was the country's engineering reality. The AI-20 engine chosen for the IL-18 wing was no accident. Alexander Ivchenko and his team in Zaporozhye had built an engine that, on paper, answered every question. 4,000 horsepower. Fuel consumption 1/3 better than a jet equivalent with the same thrust, endurance, and the stated service life. Ilyushin bet on it. For now, just note this. The bet on an engine that had not yet completed a full cycle of testing under real-world operating conditions. Right now, that may sound like a small detail. It is not a small detail. Later, it will become the center of the whole story. The technical requirement demanded the impossible in terms of schedule, and the Ilyushin Design Bureau set out to do the impossible. In parallel, aerodynamics, the power plant, landing gear for unpaved runways, navigation systems. Everything at once, all together, and all of it with one eye on the production capacity of subcontractor plants that were also handling a dozen military orders at the same time. The workshops were cold in winter. Parts arrived defective, and that was not considered a reason to stop work. It was treated as the norm, something you just had to deal with somehow. Drawings were reworked at night, on the fly. Meetings happened every day, sometimes twice a day. On July 4th, 1957, Vladimir Konstantinovich Kokkinaki took the IL-18 aloft for the first time. The flight went normally. The aircraft handled confidently, stable, predictable, almost ideal. That almost is the whole story. On April 20th, 1959, the IL-18 opened commercial service. Aeroflot, Moscow to Adler, Moscow to Alma-Ata. The press wrote about a breakthrough. Passengers looked out the windows at the 4 huge propellers and thought, this is it, the Soviet sky. The airplane looked flawless. Inside there was a wide cabin, proper seats, not military austerity, but something close to comfort. For that era, it was real luxury for someone who had previously flown on a Li-2. But in the technical inspection log of one aircraft at Vnukovo in the fall of 1960, an entry appeared. Then it was crossed out. What exactly it said, we will come back to that. But for now, remember this. The technician did not cross it out because he had made a mistake. He crossed it out because he understood that it was better not to leave that entry there. In a system where admitting a problem out loud was more dangerous than burying the problem, that was the only rational decision. Rational for him personally. For everyone else, that is a very different question. Ilyushin smoked by the window. Not a papirosa, a cigarette. Beyond the glass was a Moscow summer, June 1956, the linden trees in bloom. He had just read the decree, read it, and set the folder down on the windowsill. 13 months. That was all he had from the signature on the decree to the aircraft's first takeoff. Not to state commission acceptance, not to series production, just to first flight. For a huge, completely new mainline airliner, with new engines, with a new concept, with everything new, damn it. 13 months was not a deadline. It was an ultimatum. The Council of Ministers' decree of May 25, 1956. Dry language, like all Soviet documents. No exclamation points, no pathos. Just a list of requirements, deadlines, signatures. But behind that routine official prose, one thing was clear. The country was critically behind. Ilyushin understood the position Soviet civil aviation was in. The Li-2 was a good machine, yes, but pre-war in both spirit and substance. The IL-14 was reliable, proven, yes, but piston-powered, slow, and plainly outdated. And in London, the jet Comet had already been flying for 4 years. Or rather, it had been, until the disasters of 1953 and 1954, when fatigue cracks began tearing the aircraft apart in mid-air. But even that did not slow things down for long, and on the horizon was the Boeing 707. The Americans were no longer hiding it. Within 2 years, it would enter service. In that context, Ilyushin's decision to go with a turboprop still struck many of his colleagues as odd. Tupolev was building the jet-powered Tu-104, fast, glamorous. So why not a jet? Ilyushin explained it patiently. Here were the numbers. A jet engine burns 1.5 to 2 times more fuel for every kilometer traveled. In the Soviet Union, airports with proper concrete runways were few and far between. Most runways in Central Asia, Siberia, and the North were dirt strips or compacted gravel. A jet airliner with its landing gear loading simply could not operate there. Or it could, but only once. A turboprop was a different story. More economical, longer range, and far better suited to rough conditions. Sober, unsentimental logic. The right logic. But in 1956, the argument that it was more economical almost sounded like an admission of weakness. The decree settled that debate. The question now was no longer jet or turboprop, but can we make it in time or not? And this is where things start to get strange. Among the requirements for the aircraft was the AI-20 engine, designed by Alexander Ivchenko. Powerful, modern, 4,000 horsepower at takeoff, a very serious engine for its time. Ilyushin was counting on it from the very beginning. 4 engines under the wings, symmetrical, reliable. For now, just note this. By May 1956, the AI-20 had not yet completed a full cycle of testing in real-world operating conditions. That is not rumor. It is a fact known at the time by everyone connected with the program. Bench testing was underway. They were building up service life. But building it up is not the same as having built it up. Right now, that sounds like a technical detail, a minor one. It was not. We will come back to this engine later, and then it will become clear why, in June 1956, Ilyushin was smoking a cigarette instead of a papyrosa. Work began immediately. A design bureau is not an abstraction. It is specific people at specific drafting tables. Blueprints, hand calculations, papyrosa smoke, night shifts. They say that summer there were almost no days off at the OKB. Not because anyone banned them, there was just no time. If you're new here, subscribe. We do not write ceremonial success stories. We dig into what usually stays off camera. Some people at SAGI were quietly saying at the time that the deadline was unrealistic, and that staking everything on an engine that was not fully matured was a risk that would have to be paid for later. Those voices died out quickly. Not because anyone was directly forced to keep quiet. It was just that no one wanted to be the person standing in the way of a major state project. In a system where any doubt could be branded sabotage, silence became a career instinct. And that was a mistake. On July 4th, 1957, Vladimir Kokkinaki took the IL-18 aloft over Zhukovsky. 13 months, and they made it. That, by itself, was a small feat. Of course, the reports say nothing about that. They only list the plan items that were completed. Kokkinaki said the aircraft handled well, almost perfectly. The engines ran smoothly, and the performance figures were within normal limits. That word, almost, is the beginning of the whole story. Because between a test flight and thousands of hours in commercial service, there is a gulf. And what exactly lies at the bottom of that gulf will become clear later. First, there would be triumph, real, loud triumph. And then, a technician at Vnukovo would pick up a pen, write something in the logbook, and cross it out. But that was still 2 years away. For now, there was only the first flight, papyrosa smoke, and 13 months that somehow had fit everything in. Here is what happens to a turboprop engine when it overheats. First comes vibration, then the smell of burned oil, then fire. And if the crew is lucky, they have time to react. If not, the aircraft goes down. The IL-18 burned, not metaphorically, literally. And the engineers at the Moscow Design Bureau knew it. Let's start with the engine, because this is where the defect was hiding, the one people preferred not to talk about out loud. The AI-20, that was its name, a design from the Zaporozhye Design Bureau under Alexander Ivchenko. On paper, it was an outstanding machine. 5,000 horsepower, economical, reliable, exactly what was needed for long routes. It was this engine that let the IL-18 fly from Moscow to Vladivostok with almost no refueling. On paper, everything added up. In real life, it did not. The problem turned out to be in the reduction gearbox. This is the assembly that converts the turbine's revolutions per minute into propeller rotation. The turbine spins fast, very fast, more than 10,000 revolutions per minute. The propeller has to turn slowly or it loses efficiency. The reduction gearbox sits between them and cuts that speed down. It is a mechanically complex assembly under heavy thermal load. And this is exactly where the trouble began. During prolonged operation at cruise power, the reduction gearbox overheated. The oil lubricating it began to break down. Gradually, in a way the crew could not detect, the clearances in the gears increased. Vibration grew. And then, suddenly, without warning, the reduction gearbox could fail. Right in flight. And then it got worse. When the reduction gearbox fails, the propeller can no longer be controlled. It begins to overspeed on its own. In jargon, this is called a runaway. A 4-blade propeller, nearly 15 feet in diameter, spinning up to insane revolutions per minute, is not just a problem, it is a catastrophe. The blades can punch through the fuselage. Fragments scatter for hundreds of yards. The neighboring engine is knocked out. The aircraft loses control. That is exactly what was happening to the IL-18 in its early years of service. Not on every flight, but often enough that people at the Design Bureau were losing sleep over it. For now, just note that detail. We'll come back to it. The engineers understood the nature of the problem from the very beginning. The AI-20 reduction gearbox had been designed for a certain load envelope. But real-world service turned out to be harsher than the calculations. Routes were longer than they had been during testing. The engines ran for hours without stopping. On the Siberian routes alone, the aircraft spent 8 or 9 hours at a stretch in the air. The gearbox had not been designed for that kind of service life. One Design Bureau veteran later recalled, cautiously, without names or dates, that the first warning signs had appeared as early as the testing phase, but the deadlines were crushing. Khrushchev personally demanded that the aircraft be shown on international routes. Aeroflot was already planning the schedule. To admit there was a problem meant delaying the launch, and politically, that was impossible. Sound familiar? So that is how it entered service, with a defect that had not yet been eliminated, on the assumption that it would be refined along the way. This was standard Soviet practice. We'll finish developing it in service. Sometimes that worked. Here, it turned out differently. In the first 2 years after entering service, the IL-18 lost several aircraft. The official statistics remain classified to this day. Full data on Soviet civil aviation accidents in the late 1950s never truly made it into the public record. But from indirect evidence and partially declassified documents, the picture is an ugly one. Emergency landings after engine failures, in-flight structural failures of reduction gearboxes, at least several crashes officially written off as crew error or adverse weather conditions. That does not mean the airplane was outright bad. No, it means it was released earlier than it should have been, and the price was paid in lives. At the same time, in the West, the Lockheed L-188 Electra was taking to the skies, an American turboprop airliner, almost the IL-18's contemporary. And do you know what? It had the exact same problem. The reduction gearbox, propeller overspeed, crashes. The Americans went through it too, openly, with investigations and published findings. The Soviet side did it in silence. And that was the difference. The Americans halted Electra operations, conducted an official investigation, changed the design, and returned the aircraft to service with the engine corrected. It took time, and it cost them their reputation, but the problem was solved systematically. In the USSR, modifications were introduced quietly, one by one, without stopping operations and without publicly admitting there was a problem. One path was honest and expensive. The other was cheap and dangerous. The IL-18 survived. More than that, in time, it became one of the most reliable aircraft in Soviet civil aviation. The reduction gearbox was improved. The engine's service life was increased. Crews learned to recognize the early signs of overheating. The aircraft got better. But the question remains open. If the problem was known even before service began, why was the aircraft released anyway? And how many people paid for that decision? That is what the next part is about. There will be names, dates, and one document that long remained marked for official use only. Boris Kovalenko did not come into aviation through flight school or from a design bureau. After the army, he stayed on as a mechanic at a military airfield near Oryol. He took to turboprop aircraft immediately. He used to say, "A piston engine has the temperament of a quarrelsome woman, always creaking, always complaining. A turboprop is like a solid man, keeps quiet, but if it does speak up, then things are bad." He had worked at Aeroflot since 1960, and this is what he said about the IL-18's first flights, not for the record, but around the table at the end of a shift. From the outside, it was a real beauty. On the inside, too, passengers would step aboard and fall silent. After the IL-14, with its shaking, noise, and smell of oil, the IL-18 felt like a palace. The flight attendants smiled as if they themselves could hardly believe it was a Soviet airplane. But Kovalenko was looking at something else, at the engines after landing, at the way they cooled down, at what was left on the cowling. And that was where things started to get strange. Not a failure, not a catastrophe, just details that were not behaving quite the way the manual said they should. Oil seepage where there should not have been any. Vibration at certain power settings, slightly above normal. Signs of heating in places that, according to the documentation, were not supposed to heat up at all. Kovalenko wrote everything down, logged it, because that was the rule. If you notice a deviation, you write it up. Basic stuff. One day, the senior shift engineer called him in, sat silent for a moment, then said calmly, almost like a friend, "Borya, you're writing down too much that isn't necessary. The aircraft is normal. Why create paperwork noise?" Kovalenko did not argue. He understood right away. In a system where admitting a problem out loud could be more dangerous than keeping quiet about it, people developed a special instinct. Not malice, simple survival. He went back to the logbook and, clenching his teeth, crossed out 2 entries. That crossing out is what matters here, not the failures themselves. We'll come back to those. But the people who saw everything, understood everything, and stayed silent. Not out of cowardice, out of experience. Because by 1960, the IL-18 was no longer just an airplane. It had become a symbol. And in the USSR, symbols were not allowed to fail. The first generation of pilots transitioning to the IL-18 came from piston aircraft. Li-2, IL-14, that was their school. There, everything made sense. Piston, cylinder, spark plug. Every cough from the engine came through the control column. A turboprop was different. Quiet, smooth, steady. And that smoothness hit a trap. When something starts going wrong, you do not feel it right away. You see it on the instruments. And the instruments are already a layer between you and the machine. One instructor from those years later said the transition training was brutally fast. The state needed crews. More and more aircraft were entering service, and passenger traffic was growing like crazy. The program itself was written well, but real life made rough corrections. A flight from Moscow to Kyiv, 1961. The first officer, still completely green, was flying his first scheduled route on his own. On descent, he started extending the flaps and mixed up the sequence of procedures. The aircraft reacted in a way he was not used to. The pilot got rattled and began trying frantically to correct it. For a short time, the crew found itself in a situation no training manual described. The captain took control. The passengers noticed nothing. In the report, it became minor deviation from procedure, corrected by the crew. Kovalenko, servicing the aircraft after the flight, walked up to the captain and asked, "What happened up there?" The answer was short. The kid got spooked by his own shadow. The aircraft behaved normally. Then, after a pause, he added quietly, "Good thing it did." That "good thing it did" is an important line, Because by then, experienced crews were already talking among themselves, quietly, carefully, about how the aircraft, in certain regimes, especially with one engine out on takeoff and in hot weather on top of that, had a temperament. Not catastrophic, but a temperament. Officially, none of that existed. In the documents, silence. But among themselves, people remembered and passed it along in whispers. Be more careful in this regime. Do not rush in these conditions. Here, the aircraft may surprise you. A living, unwritten instruction running parallel to the official one. And it worked, up to a point. In 1961, that living instruction stopped being enough. The crashes of that year are a separate story for the next part, with a very different pace. But for now, just note this. The system of unwritten warnings existed precisely because writing them down was not allowed. People pass the truth through conversation, through tone of voice, through some tossed-off line in the smoking room. Soviet aviation folklore. It saved lives until it no longer did. None of this is in the documents. None of it. But people remember. July 1961. Khabarovsk Airport, 5 in the morning. An IL-18 has just landed from an overnight flight from Moscow. 8.5 hours in the air. The crew steps out, the mechanics step in. Before leaving, the captain stops by the air stairs and says to one of the mechanics, just casually, under his breath, not really to anyone in particular, "Number 3 was a little jumpy today, at cruise. Take a look." The mechanic nods. He does not write it down. That was normal. By 1961, the IL-18 had already been flying scheduled service for 2 years. Aeroflot had put it on its main routes, Moscow to Tashkent, Moscow to Khabarovsk, Moscow to Tbilisi. Passengers liked the airplane. Roomy, quiet by Soviet standards, steady. The newspapers could not praise it enough. Khrushchev flew on it to meetings with Nehru and Nasser. True, for his landmark trip to the United States in 1959, he went on the colossal Tu-114, an even more imposing machine. But the IL-18 still carried delegations, ministers, and marshals. It was an aircraft of state prestige, even if it was not always Air Force One. Inside, it was a completely different story. Pilots moving to the IL-18 from piston aircraft were entering a fundamentally different world. The Li-2 and IL-14 were understandable, almost intuitively. Mechanics, pistons, behavior you could read through your hands and, pardon the expression, through the seat of your pants before your brain had time to process it. The AI-20 turboprop engine thought differently. It responded in its own way. It failed differently too, and not always the way the textbook said it would. Transition training moved fast, maybe too fast. Aeroflot needed crews. New routes were opening one after another, and a plan was a plan. Instructors said, "The aircraft is good. Trust the instruments." Experienced pilots nodded. The younger ones, all the more so. But between what was written in the flight manual and what was passed by word of mouth in crew rooms from Sverdlovsk to Alma-Ata, there was a noticeable gap. For example, about the number 3 engine. More precisely, about its behavior in certain regimes under certain conditions. Something in the combination of air temperature, altitude, and power setting could produce an unexpected response. Not catastrophic, no, but unpleasant and demanding a calm, precise action that was not specifically taught anywhere. Because, officially, no such problem existed. In the documents, dead silence. But in conversation, it existed. One captain told another. Then that one told a third. If it does this, do this. It works. It was a living instruction, running parallel to the official one. Unwritten, unsanctioned, no signature from the chief of flight operations. That was what held the sky together. And here is one telling case. A reconstruction, yes, but true in spirit, because mechanics later described similar things more than once. A night flight, winter, somewhere on the route between Novosibirsk and Omsk. Altitude, 26,000 feet. The first officer is young, 2 years on the IL-18, flies competently. The captain is dozing. And then, number 3 starts behaving not quite right. Not an emergency, just not right. The instruments are normal, but something in the sound, something in the vibration, shifts slightly. The first officer looks at the gauges. The gauges say everything is normal. He wakes the captain. The captain opens his eyes, listens for about 10 seconds, and puts a hand on the control column. Then, he makes one small adjustment to the power setting. Number 3 settles down. The first officer asks, "What was that?" The captain is quiet for a moment. Then he says, "It's not in the manual, but remember this," and he explains it. Then he falls silent again and adds quietly, "Good thing it went normally." That phrase, "good thing it went normally," is worth more than any formal report, because inside it is an admission. It could have gone differently. They both understood that, and they both understood there was no point saying it out loud. In a system where admitting a problem was more dangerous than keeping quiet about it, people developed a special instinct. Calling it cowardice would be unfair. It was pure survival. A mechanic who recorded the abnormal behavior of a component in the logbook risked having to write an explanation, triggering an inspection, delaying the flight, and getting chewed out by management, even if he was right. Especially if he was right. Because being right in a case like that meant the airplane was not airworthy. And that meant the plan was going up in smoke. And the plan was sacred. So entries were crossed out. Not out of malice, out of instinct. But instinct is no substitute for an engineering fix, and a parallel oral instruction is no substitute for a proper investigation and an official modification. In 1961, that living instruction stopped being enough. And it was not because people suddenly got worse or pilots forgot how to fly. No, there were simply more airplanes, more routes, more crews, and not everyone had time to pass that unwritten wisdom from one person to the next. Someone had just transferred in from another unit. Someone else had transitioned to the IL-18 only a month earlier. And someone simply did not know the right captain, the one who knew. And this is where we get to what Soviet newspapers did not print a single line about. Do you know how a system starts to collapse? Not all at once. First comes a creak, barely audible. No one pays attention to it. Then it gets more persistent. And then everything comes apart. In 1961, that creak was heard by people who could not ignore it. IL-18s started falling out of the sky. Not one, not two, several aircraft. and that could no longer be dismissed as just a routine incident. July 1961. An IL-18 operating a flight crashed near Kharkiv. 41 people. The official version appeared quickly. Pilot error in difficult weather conditions. The wording was so familiar that almost no one questioned it. It did not require admitting anything inconvenient. September 1962. Another IL-18. The crash near Adler killed 90 people. And once again, the report carried those familiar lines. Flight parameter violation. Adverse conditions. Something was repeating itself, wasn't it? Now, here's how this worked in normal aviation. When a series of crashes happens on one aircraft type in a short period, the whole fleet is temporarily grounded. A commission with real authority is appointed, and the results are published. That is exactly what the Americans did when the turboprop Lockheed L-188 Electra began having problems. After two catastrophic crashes in late 1959 and early 1960, with the airplanes literally breaking up in the air and losing their wings, the FAA and Lockheed did not try to hide it. They acknowledged a design flaw: propeller power plant flutter. They announced a modification program and imposed speed restrictions across the entire fleet. It was unpleasant. It was expensive. It hurt the airplane's reputation. But passengers got a guarantee of safety. In the Soviet Union, it was different. Commissions were formed. Investigations were carried out. But the results stayed buried in folders with restricted markings. Not top secret in the literal sense, just documents that were not supposed to leave the ministry. The reports on IL-18 crashes in the early 60s never entered the public record. The families of the dead received compensation and standard wording. The newspapers were silent. Aeroflot kept flying. And no, this was not the malice of one official. It was the logic of a system that was already operating without a conductor. The commission investigating a crash was made up of people tied to the IL-18 program. The Ilyushin Design Bureau, they had created the aircraft. The Ministry of Aviation Industry, they were responsible for production. The main administration of the Civil Air Fleet, their people were operating the airplane. And each of them had a stake in how the final wording would sound. The Design Bureau did not want to admit a design flaw. That meant responsibility, reworking production aircraft, and schedule delays. The Ministry of Aviation Industry did not want to admit a manufacturing defect. That meant the plan, the bonuses, and God forbid, official reprimands. The Civil Air Fleet did not want to admit systemic problems in crew training. That would mean admitting that transition training had been rushed and sloppy. Inside that triangle, crew error was always the most convenient answer. The people blamed were dead. They could not object. The families would get compensation. The case would be closed. From the outside, the crack was invisible, but inside, people felt it. The pilots who flew these airplanes every day, the Design Bureau engineers who had known about the peculiarities of the AI-20 since the bench test stage. Remember, the engine was still immature. The technicians at regional airports who were fixing with their own hands things that officially did not exist. One of the designers who worked on the IL-18 during that period recalled many years later, cautiously, without names or exact dates. We understood everything. We knew perfectly well where the weak point was, and we were working on it. But to say it out loud in official paperwork would have meant signing the death warrant for the entire program. And the program meant hundreds of thousands of jobs, export contracts, and the political face of the country. Is that a rhetorical question? What mattered more? For a person inside that system, the answer was unambiguous. The Ilyushin Design Bureau kept working. Quietly, with no public announcements, the aircraft changed from one production batch to the next under the umbrella of planned improvements. Crew procedures were revised. Restrictions on certain flight regimes grew tighter, without explanation. Technicians were given new engine maintenance instructions, also without explanation. Sometimes, the documentation was rewritten after the fact. The airplane kept the same designation, even though in substance it had changed. It was an attempt to save it, without admitting there was anything to save it from. After its openly acknowledged modification program, the Lockheed Electra kept flying for another 3 decades. Airlines knew what they were getting. Pilots knew what they were flying. The IL-18 survived too. It flew for a long time too. But the next generation of crews inherited the aircraft without understanding what it had been through. That unwritten manual stayed with the people who had been there during the hard years. It was not passed on with the airplane. That is the real cost. Not in money, and not even in the number of accidents. The cost was that the system learned to correct its mistakes in a way that kept anyone from finding out the mistakes had existed at all. And the next time, it used the same method. And the time after that, until that became the only way it knew how to work. Was there another path? Really, was it even possible inside that system in the early 60s? Write in the comments. That is not a rhetorical question. I'm genuinely interested in how you see it. Because from here, the story turns in an unexpected direction. The Design Bureau managed it. The program was saved. The IL-18 moved to a new level. And that is where something important becomes clear about what this machine ultimately grew into. Here is what was not in the official reports, not in a single one. Where exactly the decision was made, who exactly made it, what words were used. Because the decision was simple and terrifying at the same time. Modify it quietly. Do not stop the fleet. Do not announce anything. Keep flying and quietly remove what was killing people. And this is where it gets most interesting. Not in the sense of curiosity, simply because that logic worked. It took hold, and it kept working for a long time. When, after the Kharkiv disaster in July 1961 and the Adler disaster in September 1962, the Ilyushin Design Bureau was tasked with finding the cause, no one said the words design flaw out loud. Instead of a defect, it became an operational characteristic. Instead of a design error, it became an abnormal situation requiring clarification of the documentation. Words decided everything. They determined who would be blamed. Crew error, always convenient. The crew was already gone. There was no one left to object. The report is signed. The case is closed. The Design Bureau keeps its reputation. The Ministry of Aviation Industry saves face. The Civil Air Fleet keeps meeting the plan. Everyone is satisfied, except those who understood what was really happening. One of the designers, an indirect source, later put it roughly like this: "We knew where the problem was. We simply could not write it in a document. Because if you write it down, you have to ground the fleet. And if you ground the fleet, who is going to take responsibility for that order? No one. That is your answer." Instead, modifications began. Quiet, methodical, real. Reinforcing the outer wing panel attachments. Changes to maintenance procedures. Revisions to the flight manual, adding restrictions on operating regimes that had previously been considered formally acceptable. Good engineering work, just without one thing: official acknowledgement of exactly why it was being done. Sometimes the documentation was rewritten after the fact. Modifications to aircraft already in service were recorded as scheduled maintenance work. Was that normal? No. Was it understandable? Yes. Because the alternative looked like this: ground several dozen airplanes, announce a public investigation, admit to a structural design problem, all in the middle of the Cold War, when the IL-18 was one of the Soviet Union's main symbols of aviation prestige. Politically impossible. Maybe that is exactly what it was. In the United States, the story of the Lockheed Electra, a turboprop airliner of roughly the same class and the same era, unfolded differently. After the crashes of 1959 and 1960, the same thing emerged. Propeller power plant flutter, resonant vibration, wing failure. The FAA and Lockheed carried out a joint public investigation. Temporary fleet-wide speed restrictions were imposed. An official modification program was launched, called LEAP, and newspapers wrote about it. Engine mounts and wing section attachments were strengthened. Everything was open, documented, and tied to an acknowledgement of the causes. After that, the Electra flew for another 20 years. That contrast speaks for itself. But here is what matters. The Soviet system was no less intelligent. The engineers at the Ilyushin Design Bureau knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the physics. They found solutions. They fixed what needed to be fixed. The problem was not a lack of intelligence. The problem was that all of that engineering brilliance was trapped inside a system that had completely unlearned how to admit mistakes in public. And no, this was not a conspiracy by a few specific officials. It was worse than that. Once the logic of the system had been set in motion, it worked on its own, with no conductor at all. Each person did what made sense from the standpoint of his own position. The sum of that was what it was. The IL-18 kept flying. It carried passengers. It opened new routes. It became familiar, almost like home, the airplane humming outside the window, taking you on vacation, on a work trip, back home. Millions of flights, millions of passengers. And alongside that, quiet work, invisible from the outside, by people who understood this had to be kept under control, constantly, with no room for error. Because the error could not be acknowledged. Was there another path? Really? Was it even possible inside that system in the early 60s? Tell me in the comments. That is not a rhetorical question. Because the answer to that is also the answer to what the IL-18 really was. Not just an airplane, not just a program. A mirror. Precise and deeply uncomfortable. The aircraft was refined. It got better. It survived the crisis and kept flying for decades more on dozens of routes in dozens of countries. That is a fact. But here is what the next part will show. What grew out of the IL-18 program turned out to be much bigger than the airplane itself. And that something bigger goes straight to the heart of our question. The conclusion. Who actually likes conclusions, especially when they look a little too pretty? By the mid-60s, the IL-18 had taken over the skies from Murmansk to Kamchatka. More than 300 aircraft in the Aeroflot fleet. Exports to about 15 countries, each airplane like a flag of the motherland. Ogonyok ran pieces about reliability, with photos of smiling flight attendants on the air stairs. Beautiful? Yes. Very. Now, friends, let's do the real math. But the first 6 years were a chain of major disasters. Kharkov, July 1961, 41 people. Adler, September 1962, 90. And those were only the ones that leaked into the official statistics. The aircraft itself was refined. The program was saved. On paper, everything was in perfect order. Except that someone paid for that order. A price that, of course, never appeared in the reports. That was the real bottom line, not the one on the postcards. Let's start with the numbers. It was not exactly that they were hidden out of villainy. It was just how things were done. You did not say them out loud. Serial production began in 1958, and by 1963 and 1964, when the main quiet refinements were complete, the aircraft entering the fleet were already, let's just say they were in a different class. Reinforced engine mounts, a refined wing, revised maintenance procedures. The amount of work was enormous. The aircraft really did become reliable. But officially, nothing. The same version, the same documentation neatly corrected after the fact. Ask the Ministry of Aviation Industry in 1964 about IL-18 design flaws, and you would have gotten a polite answer. No flaws. Operational peculiarities, human factors, or just the weather. Pilot error, the classic. Convenient, isn't it? The crew is gone. Who is going to argue? And now for the comparison, the uncomfortable one. But there is no way around it. Take the Lockheed Electra, an American turboprop airliner and a contemporary of the IL-18. The same kind of disaster. 2 aircraft broke up in flight. Propeller power plant flutter, whirl mode. September 1959, a Braniff flight in Texas. March 1960, Northwest Orient in Indiana. Almost copy for copy. The wing cannot withstand the resonance, and everything is over in seconds. And what did the Americans do? They carried out a public investigation. The FAA and Lockheed. They slowed down the entire Electra fleet and imposed temporary restrictions. Then they launched an official modification program, the Lockheed Electra Achievement Program, or simply LEAP. Every airplane, do you hear me? Every one went through those modifications. And then what? The Electra kept flying for another 30 years in cargo service and on regional routes. This is not some glossy tribute to American aviation. It is simply a story about how a system works when it is capable of saying, yes, we were wrong. The Soviet system, on the other hand, could not do that. And it was not because it was full of villains. Not at all. The mechanism just worked differently. To admit a design flaw out loud was not just admitting a mistake. It meant putting the very ministry that had approved the program at risk. It meant handing a trump card to Western propaganda. It meant crossing out the whole concept, Ilyushin, the turboprop approach, the very idea of building an airliner like this. In the USSR, the price of public acknowledgement was astronomical. So they stayed silent and finished fixing everything the same way, in silence. Did that make the airplane worse? No. It made it better. That is the whole paradox. By the mid-60s, the IL-18 really had been fully sorted out. Its in-service statistics stabilized. The aircraft flew. The aircraft worked. And then it kept flying for another 40 years into the early 2000s in Russia. Exports did not stop. Its reputation stayed high, as if nothing had happened. Except the people on the inside knew the price. Not everything, and not everyone, of course, but the engineers at the Ilyushin Design Bureau understood that behind version B, or V, were not just cosmetic touch-ups. Mechanics at regional airports could see it too. The new aircraft really were different. And pilots moving from the early production series to the refined ones could feel the difference, and kept quiet. The unwritten rule was brutally simple. Notice it, adapt to it, but whatever you do not write it in the logbook. That technician at Vnukovo in October 1960, remember him? He wrote it down in the logbook, then crossed it out. And that was not cowardice. No. It was rationality. The system had trained him well. An entry in the logbook would not solve the problem. It would create a problem for him. Better to deal with it yourself, quietly, on the ground. That was the real price of the triumph. The IL-18 really did open the sky to millions. Moscow to Tashkent, Leningrad to Novosibirsk, Kyiv to Khabarovsk. Routes that used to take weeks were cut down to a matter of hours. You cannot take that away from it. It matters. And no catastrophes and no crossed-out lines can erase that. But the catastrophes do not disappear just because there was a triumph. So was it a feat or a mistake? Ilyushin's right call or a system that simply used him? That is exactly where the trap is. The attempt to find one clean answer. In reality, both statements are true. It was a genuine feat by the engineers who created a competitive airliner in 13 months. And it was a real failure of the system, which could not build in any mechanism for honestly admitting its own mistakes. An engineering triumph and a systemic failure. For Soviet aviation, that was not a contradiction. That was its essence, concentrated in a single aircraft. And what grew out of the whole IL-18 story after that? That, friends, is a very different story, and arguably much bigger than the airplane itself. But that comes in the next part. There is a word for it: refinement. In Soviet aviation, it meant roughly the same thing as slight discomfort in a medical chart written after the patient was already dead. Technically accurate, in substance, meaningless. By the mid-1960s, the IL-18 had been refined. Officially, it was being improved as part of a planned development process. Unofficially, they were beating out the consequences of those very catastrophes that, officially, had never really existed. The fleet kept flying. Passengers kept boarding. Newspapers kept writing about Aeroflot's successes. And the engineers at the Ilyushin Design Bureau knew what it had cost. And they stayed silent, not because they were cowards, but because the system left them no other choice. Let's face the truth. Without numbers, all talk is empty. By 1965, Aeroflot was operating more than 300 IL-18s. That was absolute dominance across the mainline routes of a vast country. Moscow to Tashkent, Moscow to Novosibirsk, Moscow to Khabarovsk. In effect, the IL-18 tied the Soviet Union into a single transportation space. For a country where it is 5,000 miles from the capital to Vladivostok, this was not just technology. It was politics. Stalin moved people in boxcars. Khrushchev flew in an IL-18. The difference was impossible to miss. More than 100 aircraft went abroad. 17 airlines, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Egypt, India, Ghana. A Soviet airliner at Cairo Airport meant roughly the same thing as a Soviet satellite overhead. Look, we can do this. Just keep that in mind, because behind that display window stood something completely different. The catastrophes of 1961 and 1962 did not become a public turning point. The USSR had no culture of open aviation investigation. To publicly admit a design flaw meant hitting the reputation of the Design Bureau, damaging careers, and undermining the very logic of a planned economy in which an aircraft accepted into service was, by definition, fit to fly. Period. When Lockheed's Electra started breaking up in the air under the same pattern, flutter, wing failure, it went through public hell. The FAA grounded the fleet. The press tore into every detail. Then came the LEAP modification program, with an official name, deadlines, and a public report. Painful, expensive, humiliating, and completely effective. After that, the Electra kept flying for another 30 years. In the USSR, the path was different, quiet. Each new IL-18 production series differed from the one before it. Strengthened engine mounts, revised wing characteristics, refined assemblies. And do you know what the documentation called it? Improvements. Not correction of defects, just improvements. That is not a cosmetic distinction. An improvement does not require admitting an earlier mistake. It does not call into question the decision to put the aircraft into service. It does not trouble anyone at the top. Did that make the airplane worse? No. It made it better. That is the whole paradox. The engineers at the Ilyushin Design Bureau did their work honestly and professionally. The refined IL-18 became a reliable aircraft with a real safety record and a service life that kept it working into the early 2000s. That is not a slogan. That is reality. But the question does not go away. How many lives might have been saved if the system had been capable of saying out loud, "We made a mistake"? When information about a defect is closed off, it does not spread. Crews on other aircraft do not know what to watch for. Technicians out in the regions do not get updated instructions in time. The system keeps operating with a risk that is already known, but known only to a narrow circle of people somewhere in Moscow. The IL-18 survived despite everything. The defect was corrected quickly enough, and the aircraft itself had been designed from the start with a huge structural margin. Ilyushin did not like making things delicate when he could make them dependable. That was his style, and in this case, it saved the program. So what was it? A triumph of Soviet aviation? Or an expensive demonstration that the system knew how to hide the truth, even from itself? Both statements are true at the same time. It was a triumph. And it was a mistake. One does not cancel out the other, precisely because the mistake was corrected and the triumph turned out to be real. An aircraft as symptom, not the disease, the symptom. A precise indicator of how the system worked, capable of engineering feats and structurally incapable of public honesty. This is not a judgment on the people who built it and flew it. It is a harsh but accurate description of the environment they were forced to work in. That technician at Vnukovo in October 1960 crossed out his entry not because he was a dishonest man. He did it because he understood perfectly well that an honest logbook entry would fix nothing, while causing him plenty of personal trouble. The system reproduced silence rationally, and that silence had a price. And what grew out of this whole story afterward? Not just 300 aircraft in Aeroflot and 17 foreign airlines. Something much bigger grew out of the IL-18, far bigger than the airplane itself. But that is for the next part. I stood next to one once, at Monino, late in the fall, when the museum is almost empty and the attendants start hinting that it's about time. I stood there, looking at that silver silhouette with 4 propellers and thought, there it is. The machine that opened the sky to millions of people. The one that flew from Moscow to Vladivostok when its competitors could barely make it to the Urals. The one exported to 17 airlines around the world. The one that stayed in service for more than 40 years. And at the same time I was thinking about that technician at Vnukovo, the one from October 1960, about the entry he crossed out. That is the question that has been there since the very start of this story. How can the same thing be both an achievement and a mistake? How can an aircraft that cost dozens of lives because of defects the system could not admit out loud become a symbol of Soviet aviation greatness? And is greatness worth it at that price? I don't know any simple answer. And honestly, I'm not even sure one exists. Today, IL-18 stand in several museums. At Monino, there is one of the few surviving examples. Another is in Ulyanovsk. There used to be one in Kiev. I don't know what became of it. In some places, these aircraft survived into the 2000s as freighters. The last flights in Russia were around 2002. 43 years in service. For an airplane, that is almost forever. Go up close to it if you ever get the chance. Look at the wing. Right here, at the root of the right outer wing panel, if you know where to look, you can see where the structure was reinforced. Not at first, not at birth. Later, after Kharkiv, after Adler, after the system finally, quietly, without announcements, admitted that something had been going wrong. You can't see it from the outside. You're not supposed to. And that, in one image, is the whole IL-18 story. Look at what this program left behind. Not in museums, in aviation. The answer is much bigger than it seems. The IL-18 gave rise to the Soviet school of turboprop airliners, with its whole design culture and all its compromises. It produced engineers who later worked on the IL-62, IL-76, and IL-86. Out of it came a crew training system that, with a lot of grinding, cursing, and blood, still learned how to handle fundamentally new technology. Out of it came the country's aviation infrastructure, airports, ground services, training bases, all the things without which not one later Soviet airliner would have existed. That is not a small legacy. But the question does not go away. How many lives could have been saved if the system had known how to say, "We were wrong," out loud? Not in closed reports, not in rewritten documentation, not in quiet modifications with no explanation, but directly, publicly, the way Lockheed did with the Electra. Temporary speed restrictions, a public investigation, an official modification program with a name and deadlines, an acknowledgement. We will never know the exact number. The documents were classified, some were destroyed, and some were rewritten so thoroughly that it is now impossible to tell where the truth is. But the question remains, and with the years it has not grown any quieter. That is the IL-18 paradox. This aircraft proved that Soviet aviation could create outstanding airplanes. And at the same time, it proved that the Soviet system did not know how to deal with them honestly. It knew how to build. It did not know how to admit when something had gone wrong. It knew how to fix things. It did not know how to talk about it. And strangest of all, that combination still worked. The airplane flew. People got to Vladivostok, to Tashkent, to Havana. Aeroflot carried millions of passengers. 17 foreign airlines bought these aircraft and were, on the whole, satisfied. The story of the IL-18 is not a story of failure. It is a story of success that had its own price. That technician at Vnukovo crossed out the entry. Not because he was a coward, not because he didn't understand, because the system gave him exactly one choice: stay silent and keep working, or write it down and become the man who grounded a flight, missed the quota, created a problem. He chose silence. The system had trained him to. And here is the final bitterness. These were exactly the people who held this aviation together. Technicians who knew and stayed silent. Pilots who felt what was happening and adapted. Engineers who fixed at night what could not be admitted in daylight. They were not accomplices to a crime. They were hostages of a system that left them no other choice. The IL-18 was a great airplane. That is true. And that truth does not cancel out the other one. If you have personal memories of this aircraft, if you flew on it, saw it at an airport, heard about it from your father or grandfather, or maybe someone close to you worked with it, write in the comments. Living memory is worth more than any archive. I'm not saying that for effect. I read every comment. And subscribe. There are many more deep dives like this ahead. About machines, about people, about a system that knew how to do the impossible and paid its own price for it. That silver silhouette with 4 propellers stands at Monino. The attendants are already hinting that it's time. And I am still standing there.